suffer as a result of NHS strikes. The RCN has threatened further industrial action in the new year if ministers don't respond to their demands within 48 hours of tomorrow's walkout. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says he's open to talks with Unite ahead of the strike action this week, but suggested the government will not budge on pay. He's put the onus on unions to ensure they supply sufficient emergency cover so patients can get the care they need. The Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, told us the ministers need to start negotiating.
We would actually have a serious conversation with our NHS staff. We've not got that at the moment. You've said that Steve Barclay is saying he's prepared to talk. Well, let's see if we actually see that. But as I say, it feels to me they've gone into lockdown while the country grounds to a halt. That's not good enough.
High Court judges will rule today whether the government's policy to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda is lawful. The government's been criticised for the plan to send asylum seekers there, with charities claiming the East African nation lacks a fair and efficient asylum system. Two judges at the Royal Courts of Justice will give their ruling on the legal challenge this morning. More than 130 bus companies will cap single fares to help passengers amid the cost of living crisis. National Express and Stagecoach are among companies which will introduce the £2 upper limit for fares in England outside of London from next year. It's to help people who are travelling for work, education and medical appointments. The scheme's being backed with £60 million worth of government funding. Elon Musk could step down as the boss of Twitter just 2 months after buying the social media site. It follows a poll he launched on the platform yesterday asking Twitter users whether or not he should step down as the chief executive. 57% of 14 million voters said yes. Musk's faced much criticism since taking over Twitter, including his decisions around content moderation. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, first this morning, the skipper of the fishing boat, which helped rescue dozens of migrants from the English Channel last week, has angrily hit out at UK immigration policy for making what he describes as the tragedy inevitable. In his first full interview since the tragedy, Raymond Strachan told GB News that British authorities have been acting as a migrant taxi service, encouraging increasing numbers of people to make the journey. Well, today the government is expecting a High Court ruling on whether their planned policy of sending Channel asylum seekers to Rwanda is lawful or not. Well, our Home and Security editor Mark White has also obtained more exclusive images of Wednesday's rescue operation in the Channel. A warning, you might find parts of this report difficult to watch.
Out in the pitch black of the English Channel, the sound of panicked cries for help. The six-man crew of the scallop boat Arcturus rush to help as they come alongside the stricken migrant boat. These images are deeply disturbing, but they highlight the very real dangers for these flimsy vessels and the quick thinking and bravery of local fishermen turned rescuers.
If we wasn't there, probably 45 people dead without any trace. Nobody was knowing they was there. I looked over the side, there was about 5 or 6 migrants hanging off the side of the boat.
For Raymond's crew, it was their training and instinct to help that kicked in.
It's not an easy task to try to pull a panicking person out of the water when they're fully clothed, soaking wet. When the other migrants in the dinghy seen they was getting rescued, they started swimming towards the boat.
There was, Raymond says, huge relief when the lifeboats and Coast Guard helicopters reached the scene.
It doesn't matter your political views on the migrant crisis. When you see people in the water screaming, shouting, begging for their life, if you've any compassion at all, the human nature thing to do is to rescue people. And that's what we did.
On board the Arcturus, although these survivors were rescued, they were clearly hypothermic. The scallop boat's crew got them out of their wet clothes and into warm showers before giving them their dry clothes and some hot food. Outside, the fast rescue boat from the Royal Navy's offshore patrol vessel HMS Severn joined in the search for other survivors. As on board the fishing boat, medics checked over those rescued. Raymond Strachan said the events of Wednesday morning were inevitable. Like all local fishing crews, they regularly see migrant boats and often have to help. Like here in January, when the Arcturus had to stand by alongside two inflatables near Dungeness while they waited for UK authorities to arrive on scene. And that same month, this astonishing sight of 5 young men crammed in a tiny inflatable rowing across the channel without an onboard motor and not a single life jacket among them.
I've seen 5 successful crossings last Sunday. Then you get the UK government saying they're getting send patrol boats out to stop the crossings. Well, I see the patrol boats there, but I just see them like a taxi service. That's what it is.
Although Wednesday saw tragedy in the Channel, Raymond says it won't act as a deterrent to these crossings. He and his crew expect to see many more migrant boats out here in the months ahead. Mark White, GB News.
Well, I'm delighted to say that Mark joins me live in the studio now to digest this story and really putting images to the words that we've seen so often now for the last few years. It's pretty harrowing.
Yeah, and good to speak to Raymond Strachan as well, who's still out there fishing after this tragedy. They've just got to get on with their lives. So difficult to be able to get into communication, in a sense, for us to be able to record an interview with him. But he's very clear in what he says about the driver for all these people coming across, which is once you get in the water, then you're guaranteed that you're going to be picked up by UK authorities because you'll get an escort across the channel to the English side of the UK waters, into UK waters, and then you'll be picked up by Border Force on the lifeboat. So he believes that's acting as a lure for more and more people to come across. What the UK and French governments will say, of course, is that they're duty-bound to respond to anybody in a flimsy vessel like this, because clearly it's not safe in a busy shipping lane with less than ideal weather conditions often. And we saw, obviously, on Wednesday that they're prone to just puncturing and deflating like that one did. The one 13 months ago where 27 people died also deflated. So they say they, under international maritime law, have no choice but to respond to them. But what Raymond Strachan says is, in doing that, you're effectively acting as a taxi service.
Yes, and I suppose a pull factor, and it does seem frustrating, really, to see sort of people getting in these boats and then be carried along to the other side. I wonder, though, whether or not the announcement last week in Parliament from the Prime Minister about this fast-track processing, about getting Albanians back to Albania, for instance, whether or not it will make a difference that when people, if we sort of have to accept under international norms, international law, everything else, people at sea will be protected and guarded, if at the point they arrive on the shores of the United Kingdom, they can be turned around really very rapidly and removed back to safe countries, I suppose that may well go some way to break the model.
It may well, but we have to see how that will actually work in practice, because it was a year ago that the government in 2021 signed a deal with Albania for a more rapid removal of foreign national offenders, those who commit crimes who are from Albania in this country, but also those who arrive legally in this country as well. That had to be updated back in August by Priti Patel because it clearly wasn't working. Now it's effectively being updated again. But it doesn't take into account what the potential challenges are once it gets into the hands of the human rights lawyers. So will it be as rapid as they say it will be? And remember as well that although we have a particular and acute problem with Albanians making up around about a quarter of the 45,000 who've crossed in the last year, that's still only a quarter there's 3/4 of those crossing who are not Albanians and who wouldn't be subject to this rapid removal. And also the number, I'm told, of Albanians in the last month or two who are coming across is starting to decline.
Interesting. Let's now just turn quickly to this ruling today. The Rwanda policy is something that the Rishi Sunak government seems to have leaned back a bit from, focusing on other areas primarily. How much does today's ruling by the Supreme Court actually matter?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the Sunak government and the Truss government beforehand, they both said they were still wedded to the Rwanda policy, but they have to let it play out in the courts. So we've got this ruling today. Now, this will be crucial because if it finds in favour of the government, as previous court rulings in the UK have, and says this is lawful, what will happen next? Because there's bound to be an appeal if it goes against the human rights groups. They're bound to appeal it again to another court. Will the UK government try to seize the initiative and get some people on a plane over there to get the policy at least partially underway before there's an appeal?
And could that appeal go to the ECHR, which seems to be the bane of many Home Secretaries?
Sadly, the way that these appeals and counter-appeals and everything else goes within the court system here, you start at the beginning again with a judicial review. They will, make a ruling. Then you go to the appeal court. You potentially go to the Supreme Court, and you could go to ECHR. You could, go all the way up. So it's frustrating. But what does the government have some backbone here? If it goes in their favour, will they try and push a few hundred people on flights and get them at least? Get the process, as I say, started. Likewise, of course, if the decision goes against the government, it's obvious, I think, the government will continue to try to appeal it to the next court up as well.
It does seem remarkable that in this country the government can legislate for something and Parliament is supposed to be supreme, and that can be struck down in the courts. It's almost like we're moving to some sort of American system, and that's not our system of government, really. Mark White, thank you so much for talking us through all of those issues. Really concerning for many, no doubt. But two other news today, and something else really on the forefront of political discussion. The General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, that's trade union, Pat Cullen, has warned that Rishi Sunak, she says that if the government doesn't negotiate over pay specifically this week, nurses will return to the picket lines in January. Well, let's listen to what the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Steve Barclay, had to say yesterday.
It's important that the trade unions honour the commitments that they've given to safeguard both life-threatening responses and emergency responses. Now, we haven't actually had that confirmed in the practical arrangements that the trade unions put in place with each trust. I'm calling on them to do so. I'm very keen to continue talking with them because all of us should be focused on that patient safety.
Well, that comes ahead of another 48 hours of walkouts by nurses tomorrow. Ambulance drivers will then strike on Wednesday. And this morning, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, John Ashworth, spoke to us on GBNews and was asked, of course, about what Labour would do about it.
Negotiate on pay, that's the first thing. We would recruit more doctors and nurses, because this isn't just about pay, it's about the pressures they are under because they're so short of staff across the whole of the health service. So we would get rid of the non-dom tax rate, and we would use the money from that non-dom tax change to recruit more doctors, more nurses, more paramedics in our NHS. So that would relieve pressures on the front line, and it would actually help us treat patients more quickly, because there's a massive waiting list. 400,000 people are waiting over a year for treatment, many of them waiting in actual pain and distress for that treatment. So we'd recruit more doctors and nurses, and we would sit down and negotiate about the terms and the conditions under which they work, about the way in which the independent pay process works. So we would actually have a serious conversation with our NHS staff. We've not got that at the moment.
Well, Jonathan Ashworth speaking there. Let's discuss it all with our political reporter, Olivia Utley. Olivia, it does seem that it's a curious position for the Labour Party to take. They're talking about abolishing non-dom tax status. Now, according to most independent assessments, the most that could raise is £3 billion. That's nowhere near the demands of the nurses for pay.
Exactly. It's essentially just a drop in the ocean. And what we know is that Labour government after Labour government have tried to do this, have talked about doing this. This was talked about when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, and it's never happened precisely because it just doesn't raise enough to make it worth doing, enough to annoy some of those people who are coming into the UK and quite often investing in other ways in the UK economy. So that definitely isn't a silver bullet. John Ashworth there also talking about how he'd get round the table and talk about it. But it's interesting that Labour haven't actually said that they would agree to the 19% pay rise demand that Pat Cullen is asking for. And from what we've heard from Pat Cullen and Steve Barclay today and yesterday, that's the only thing that really matters. That is the sticking point. Talking about working conditions is all very well, but Pat Cullen has made it very clear that this is about money, which means that we are at a very, very difficult point because Rishi Sunak has ruled out a one-off pay offer, which is what happened in Scotland, which did manage to avert a nurses' strike. The Scottish government there offered £2,200 flat fee for all nurses in a one-off payment. That might save us from more strikes here, but Rishi Sunak has already ruled it out. And Steve Barclay is now busy making sure that life-saving treatment is preserved when the paramedics strike later in the week. So he's split many ways, and it's quite hard to see what wiggle room we've got left, really.
And it's fascinating to see that paramedics are striking because in real terms, paramedics have had their pay increase by quite a considerable degree over the last decade. But if we're looking at the cost of this, obviously there are far fewer nurses working in Scotland than in England. That sort of flat fee thing might have been affordable for Nicola Sturgeon. The government is saying now that for every percentage pay increase that nurses ask for, that costs the taxpayer £700 million. It's very hard to see where any of this money might come from.
It's very hard, and of course the worry on top of the fact that the government just literally doesn't have the cash to make it happen is obviously that if you did start going for a 5% above RPI inflation pay increase for nurses, then you would have to replicate that across whole swathes of the public sector who we know are already annoyed about their pay and are striking all this week, which would obviously lead us into an inflationary spiral, which is exactly what the government doesn't want to happen.
And yet the politics of this are very, very difficult because we can sit here and talk about the numbers and do this sort of abacus economics, and yet interestingly, the polls over the last couple of weeks have showed that the public generally are sceptical of the government's arguments and are very, very sympathetic to those going on strike, even those who, some might argue, are putting lives at risk.
Yes, it's interesting to see the difference, actually, between the public polling on train strikers and the public polling on nurses. And you can see the public support for the train strikes ebbing away practically as we speak. Even some of the train strikers themselves, support for those strikes are going down and down with each poll. And yes, Mick Lynch and his union managed to win the last vote, but it was quite a close thing, really. Meanwhile, public support for the nurses, who of course we clap for over COVID, is really still very high. And also, you've got that worry there that people aren't too fussed about the politics of it. They can't be moved by the idea of an inflationary spiral. What they're worried about is what's going to happen to their families over Christmas. And there's an interesting story on the front of the Telegraph today suggesting that elderly, healthy people might be unable to spend Christmas with their families because without enough nurses, discharging people becomes impossible. Wow. So you've got thousands of people in beds who don't need to be there and don't want to be there. And that's the sort of thing which makes people think, come on, Steve Barclay, find a way through this for all our sakes.
Really, really fascinating, the blame game here, which no doubt will roll on and on. Let's bring in John Curtis now, the psophologist extraordinaire, titan of political science, of course, and professor of politics at the University of Strathclyde. Sir John, thank you for joining us this morning. First of all, has it surprised you, perhaps, the difference that we've started to see here? People being less supportive of the RMT and the train strikes, but incredibly supportive of the nurses, for example, the paramedics and everyone else within the NHS?
No, I don't think we should be surprised about this. In essence, what you see in this polling of different groups is, in a sense, a reflection of what we might want to call the perceived social value of the occupations. At the end of the day, we think that nurses do a very good job, a very important job. We are therefore sympathetic to them. were less inclined to take that view about postal workers and of those who are running our trains. And one group that's certainly, which is also on strike, getting much less publicity, but is certainly not getting much public support, are the driving examiners. So the truth is, nobody likes a driving examiner unless they say you've passed. So the truth is, I don't think we should be surprised about this. And it does therefore suggest that insofar as the government wants to hold a firm line, probably trying to hold a firm line against the nurses and the ambulance workers is politically the most difficult bit for it to do. Whereas standing up to the postal workers and the train strikers, if you want to put it in those terms, is probably something politically that's much easier for the government to do. Not least of the reasons is that one of the ways in which I think the nurses and the ambulance workers have perhaps quite savvily pursued their case is to try to link their case to broader public concern about the state of the public services, in particularly the health service. I think one of the risks that the government faces, at least, is that if indeed these strikes go on, that this will become part of a wider narrative whereby people blame the government for the state of the health service, about which we know there's a great deal of dissatisfaction. So the government, I think, does have to play its hand quite carefully. That said, I think it's also true that even the nurses and the ambulance drivers have to be careful not to overplay their hand. Although some of the polling at the weekend suggested that support for their actions was holding up, that was particularly with reference to the strikes that are taking place before Christmas. Other polling from Ipsos suggested even for the nurses and for the ambulance workers, support, although still relatively high, has gone down during the course of the autumn, and that certainly the public don't necessarily endorse the idea of a 19% pay rise, which has now got so much headline publicity in the case of the nurses. So I think it's also true that the unions do now need to think quite carefully about how they play their hand.
And yet, if we look into how this flows into the wider perception of political parties, we saw the most extraordinary MRP poll last week from Savanta, which found that the Conservatives, on their numbers, would crash down to just 69 seats, down from 365 at the last election to 69 in their MRP projection. It's the most remarkable picture. John Curtis, do you believe it?
Well, let's at least give you an explanation as to why you might get something like those kinds of numbers, if not necessarily those exact numbers. The truth is, of course, that poll, like most other polls at the moment, still suggests that the Conservatives are around 20 points down behind Labour in the polls, and that they are something like 16, 17 points adrift of where they were back in 2019. Now, if a party's support's going down that much, it's not possible for its support to be going down by 16 or 17 points everywhere, because there are quite a lot of constituencies where there isn't 16 or 17% of the vote left for the Conservatives to fall. And that therefore, although at the moment when we look at a 20-point lead on the conventional calculation, we say, well, the Conservatives will certainly lose badly, markedly less than 200 seats, but maybe Labour not much more than 350, 360. Once we take into account that arithmetic fact that actually, given the extent of the Conservative fall, the Conservative vote is undoubtedly going to fall more heavily in places that they're trying to defend than in the elsewhere. And we saw this in the two by-elections. The swing in the two by-elections was less than in the national polls. Once you bear that in mind, then actually, yes, given the current position, at least the immediate prospect, at least for the Conservatives in the general election, is perhaps even worse than the headline treatment of a 20-point lead might imply.
And yet I suppose at the end of the day, these are all snapshots rather than predictions. No doubt in the new year, Rishi Sunak will be trying everything he can do to decrease that 20-point deficit, which does look pretty disastrous for the party as things stand. But John Curtis, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really interesting stuff to go over there. Let's finally catch up with Olivia Utley, because what does Rishi Sunak need to do now to try and turn this stuff around? Because it looks like the party is in not really much better shape than it was under Liz Truss.
No, and that's a big problem for Rishi Sunak. What does he do about it? I mean, in the medium to long term, he might be able to find quite a powerful way through the strikes with this legislation which he's talking about, which would curtail the rights of strikers, essentially, and ensure that some minimum service is at least on offer. We know that that is actually a bit caught up in the hedgerows at the moment. He said that he's going to bring it forward sometime in the new year, but we haven't yet heard any sort of timescale at all. Otherwise, he does need to have some sort of plan. And what was really noticeable about the autumn budget is that there was very little sort of pro-growth conservative vision. And I think if he is going to find a way to turn this round, it's got to be about more than just, you know, getting through the days, which seems to be what he's doing at the moment.
Well, let's look out for that vision. But for now, that's it for the programme. Thanks for joining me here on The Briefing. Up next, it's Bev Turner.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives